Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Carrie Burke, your moderator for today's webinar, Using Collaboration to Make Application Vulnerability Management a Team Sport. You may send in questions at any time during the presentation via the chat feature. We will collect these and address them at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce Dan Cornell, a globally recognized application security expert who holds over 15 years of experience architecting, developing, and securing web-based software systems. As Chief Technology Officer and Principal at DENIM Group, he leads the technology team to help Fortune 500 companies and government organizations integrate security throughout the development process. Presenting alongside Dan, we have Kyle Pippin. Kyle has over 15 years of experience in successfully building and delivering enterprise-level software products and projects. As product manager of ThreadFix, Kyle is involved in all aspects of product planning, development, and presentation. He is responsible for ensuring ThreadFix meets or exceeds customer needs and expectations by working directly with clients, project management, and technical leads to facilitate the greatest possible value to customers.
Thanks, Carrie. And thanks everybody for taking some time out of your day to attend this webinar. Hope everybody out there is safe and healthy in the world that continues to be a wild and crazy place. Today we're going to talk about using collaboration to make application vulnerability management a team sport. I get inquiries from journalists from time to time about different things. What's my take on a certain issue? What's my take on this trend or something like that? So I've gotten questions. Well, how does a global pandemic impact application security? How does work from home impact application security? And I understand that they've got column inches to fill, but most answers to that question is going to be crap. To say, well, here's how universal work from home is going to impact the next edition of the OWASP Top 10. That's not. I don't know that. We could probably make something up for that. I don't know if that's capturing the most important thing. But one of the things that we have seen is that this work from home, universal work from home, is really changing organizational dynamics and team dynamics of the application security teams and the development teams that they are working with. And before, just because in the technology discipline and security and development, those have been disciplines that could be done remotely. Most organizations had at least some aspect of being distributed or of remote work, but now we've taken that to the extreme. And so that's at least one area where, if you look at application security, the SQL injection, for any rational reason I can think of, is not scarier in a work from home world than in a pre-pandemic world. But if you're looking at running your software security assurance program, if you're looking at your SDLC and your secure SDLC, that is an area where this hyper distribution is going to have an impact, and it's something where we've seen that collaboration, which always was important and of value, is now of critical importance, and that's one of the things to pay attention to. Is like how do the team dynamics change? How do the interaction dynamics change? And that's what we're going to be talking about today, is some of the things that we've observed in helping organizations stand up and mature their software security assurance programs, with some examples from the ThreadFix platform of how we see some of these interactions be implemented. So at DENIM Group, again, a lot of folks here are probably familiar with DENIM Group, but at DENIM Group, we're building a world where technology is trusted. And the focus for today is really, how do we help organizations more repeatably and reliably build secure software? And again, as many people probably know, we have a combination of advisory testing services, as well as our ThreadFix platform. The agenda for today, I want to talk about some of the challenges with application vulnerability management. And they're the challenges of vulnerability management in general, but I think that in the application space, you have some additional challenges. And so we'll talk about those. And provide an overview of the ThreadFix platform, just to baseline, set an understanding of what does ThreadFix do, how do organizations use it, what benefit do they get out of it. And then we're going to talk about two different dynamics that we see. The first is collaboration within security teams. How do security teams deal with the data that they're ingesting and collaborate in order to identify these are the most important vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. I'm going to talk about a different dynamic. How do security teams, application security teams, interact with development teams? Because this is a dynamic that is really broken in a lot of organizations, and that causes a lot of pain and suffering that doesn't necessarily need to be there. We'll give some examples along the way, ThreadFix based, but again, I think the most critical thing that we've seen is getting these collaboration dynamics, however they're implemented, getting those collaboration dynamics done right. And then we'll have time at the end for questions. Please, use the Q&A capability to submit any questions, and we'll get those answered at the end. And as I noticed after our last webinar, having Kyle here means that we can get much more cogent answers to very specific questions, as opposed to hand-waving stuff that I can provide. So we're thrilled to have Kyle along today, helping out with that. So let's kick it off by looking at the general issue with application vulnerability management and the challenges associated with that. And one observation I have starting out is more traditional vulnerability management. Which, if you go to industry analysts and whoever you talk to, like when you say vulnerability management, that has a very network and infrastructure focus. It's how am I taking my Nessus, my Qualys, my Nexpose results? How do I take those, prioritize those, and then get those to server operations teams, to get patches installed or configurations applied? And so that's really, when you say vulnerability management, that is how most folks in the industry think about this. We're going to be talking about application vulnerability management. So it's that same challenge, but applied to vulnerabilities and weaknesses in software. And one observation I have is that traditional vulnerability management seems to do this a lot better. I think organizations are a lot more mature in those practices. Those communications pathways are well established. The programs are older, and in a lot of cases, server patches are a lot more straightforward to apply than custom software changes. Jeff Williams, makes the analogy of, in the network world, you're dealing with Legos, right? Do I have these fixed pieces snapped together in the right way? In the application world, it's silly putty, right? We're going to need to change the code, but how do we change the code and whatnot? And I think that is, I think that's a helpful way to look at some of the challenges. And it's not to say that the traditional vulnerability management, the network vulnerability management folks have it easy. A lot of servers still don't get patched, for, I don't know if I want to say valid reasons, but for reasons, right? I mean, there's plenty of good reasons not to patch servers, if you've had downtime associated with that and whatnot. But certainly in a world where you can solve a problem by applying a patch or making a specific configuration change, that does make it a little bit easier than when you've got to go to a development team and, as we'll see, get them to change what they're doing, make a change to code, where they may have different options of how to do that. It's just a little bit more complicated, or I would say a materially more complicated situation. And this is hard. Application vulnerability management is hard. And the main reason that we've found it to be hard is there's a lot of players involved. You have the application security team, you have the development team, and potentially you've got the involvement of your GRC team. And again, I'm talking more about job functions depending on what your org structure looks like. And in a DevOps, DevSecOps, et cetera world, these groups may all have different names. But this is hard. Application vulnerability management is hard. And especially if you look at these teams as separate, everyone has different incentives and goals. The development teams are focused on features, functions, and timelines. Right? They've got work in front of them. They've got things that they need to do. And, and there's their curmudgeons in the security industry say, well, developers don't care about security. And I haven't found that to be the case. I've found that developers care very much about security, but they care about security alongside of many other concerns. They care about security, but they also care about performance, and they also care about quality, and they also really care about deadlines and features that got promised to other important stakeholders. And so I think, as we'll get into this more, I think some empathy is valuable for security teams, because the security curmudgeon perception that these developers just don't care about security, and so we've got to find a way to beat them into doing what we want, as we'll see, it doesn't have a great outcome. The application security teams, they're typically looking to address risk. They want more secure software. They don't want the vulnerabilities to be found and exploited. And and that's a very important thing. It's again a one factor of many things that the business needs to be concerned about when they look at overall risk and reward decisions that are being made broadly. And then also, and again, in some cases, we see the GRC teams being involved, where their goal is to address risk, reach and maintain compliance, and make sure that certain controls are implemented. And so, again, players that have different skill sets, they have different incentives in place, and in organizations, they have different levels of political power, political capital to expend. And what really makes this sad is that access to developers' time is a zero-sum game, right? Your developers are going to work, hopefully like an 8-hour day, again, as knowledge workers, just saying, well, for security, we're just going to add 2 hours to the workday, probably not going to be long-term successful. And so this access to developers' time is a zero-sum game. If you're fixing security bugs, then you're not developing features, right? If you're developing features, then you're not fixing security bugs. And that's just a cold, hard reality is, if you're going into Scrum and you're looking at story points, like you're either doing story points on features or on fixes, and it's not magic. You don't get extra magic stuff. And also the problem here is like viewing it like this creates winners and losers. One of the things that we, again, for anybody that caught our Security Champions webinar, or I'll include, I've got a link to this at the end of the slide deck. That's one of the things that we talked about in that webinar is, just because you have security champions, you've anointed people as security champions, like you don't get their time for free. Right. Obviously, training them, you can make them more effective, make them more efficient. But anointing someone a security champion just doesn't magically mean that you added some number of hours to their work week where you get free security. So you got to understand where you're allocating people's time. But that situation of viewing it like this, creates winners and losers, where security teams tend to be in opposition to development teams. And the typical outcome we see here is that the application security team requires that certain vulnerabilities get fixed, whether that's determined by risk or by some sort of a policy. The development teams try to put this off as long as possible because they've got other things, other stakeholders that are really fixed on them doing other tasks that aren't necessarily security related. And all too often, the group of the best executive support gets their way. But really, this makes, it makes everyone a loser, right? Like if you think of, I was a RA in college, and one of the things they talked about was, in an aggressive scenario, like one person's the winner and one person is the loser. In a passive scenario, it's a flip, like that person's the winner and I'm the loser. In an assertive situation, what you're looking for is something where everybody's kind of rights are respected. And that's something that I've carried forward, and I think is an interesting and very important way to look at the world, especially for security teams. And so really when we look at this, we need to find a way to stop the fighting between these teams and look at how do we get these people to start playing on the same team, and view this through the lens of teamwork, of multiple groups coming together to accomplish a goal. And that's one of the threads that runs through a lot of the discussions that we've had with organizations navigating digital transformation, the changing role of the security team, the changing message that they need to have in order to stay relevant. Very similar to what we've seen culturally as DevOps seeks to change the culture to break down barriers between development and operations teams. This is your DevSecOps. Well, hey, security needs a seat at that table too, but they need to understand, what that means. Both the responsibilities as well as the role they play. And so, if we look at critical elements of teamwork, what does that mean in the context of application vulnerability management? When we talk about, if you look at respect, right? If you've got a team, those teammates need to have respect for one another. All the parties have to acknowledge that the other parties have a valid role to play, and that their objectives are valuable and rational and good. You have to assume that the other parties on your team are good actors, that potentially have a different perspective. Application security needs to recognize that the development gets instantly rewarded when they build features, and occasionally disciplined if vulnerabilities are found and exploited. And they need to understand the driver in most organizations is not let's be as secure as possible, but let's go out and delight customers, and worry about security as an aspect of that. I think the development teams also need to recognize that the application security, isn't the Department of No, and that they have a legitimate role to play helping the organization move faster, but moving faster in a secure way. We look at roles. All parties are going to have different capabilities and roles to play as part of the process. Its application security needs to be able to characterize risk, as well as compliance implications, and provide sensible explanations of how things need to be fixed. The development team needs to communicate, hey, how do you guys need to get this data about risk and about vulnerabilities translated over us? And how does it need to be presented? What context do they need? What level of detail do they need in order to be able to act on it to make these interactions as efficient as possible? And really the focus that we're going to talk about today is communication and collaboration. Communication, the parties have to be able to effectively communicate information within the different groups as well as across these groups. And again, that's the focus for today. App security needs to have their act together internally before engaging with the development teams to, again, to have their communications be as efficient as possible. And the application, security needs to communicate vulnerability information. What's the risk associated with? Where is this located in the application we want you to fix? Here's remediation guidance on how you can fix this in a pragmatic way. And the development teams need to be able to communicate their status and progress and if they're running into challenges. So now we'll just run through a really quick ThreadFix overview, talk about the ThreadFix platform and what it does for organizations. And some people may have heard this, but I want to tell the ThreadFix origin story because it really is really bound up in this concept of collaboration and communication between these different groups. And so we were working with a financial services organization a number of years ago. ThreadFix is a 10-year-old platform at this point. A lot of water under the bridge. A lot has gone into it. So maybe it was 11 or 12 years ago, we were working with an organization, and the app security team needed to test a line of business app. So they ran app scan, generated a 300-page report with a color graph on the front page. Went and handed it to the dev team and said, hey guys, fix this stuff. It's security. It's the most important thing. The dev team said, well, how do we fix this? And I'm pretty sure that's a section in the report. And so, security went back to their desk. Developer put it in a drawer, forgot about it. Then later on, they were, the security came around and they were doing perimeter web scanning of Qualys WAS or with Qualys WAS. Ran a scan, generated a 200-page PDF with a different color graph on the front. Went and handed the dev team and they said, hey, here's some additional security testing that we've been doing. Oh, by the way, what'd you guys do with the stuff that we gave you before? Did you fix all that stuff? Dev was like, well, some of it, but how is this related? Does this overlap what we saw before? Nobody had a great answer. And so the dev team went up through their management and said, hey, the security people came around again, and this time they're actively wasting my time. They're handing me these PDFs. They can't tell me what to do with the data. They can't tell me what I need to fix. We've got all this other stuff that we're doing. What are you going to do for me? And so, a rock got dropped on the security team from high above that said, you are not allowed to talk to another developer until you can tell them, here's the specific stuff that I need you to fix and why. And here's exactly how you're going to fix it. And until you can meet that bar, you can't have any interactions with development teams. And as observers, we were looking at this and seeing, nobody was a bad actor in this case, right? The security team was trying to do their job, right? They're saying, hey, we did some testing. We found vulnerabilities. We think there's risk. We're worried, but we can't actually fix this problem ourselves. And the development team was also doing their job. They had priorities in addition to security. It wasn't they didn't care about security, but when something gets lobbed over the fence, that doesn't, that's not an effective way to communicate, so that they can prioritize these security things alongside of other stuff. And so that interaction, observing that interaction, and then also seeing hints of that in other organizations is what led us to create the ThreadFix platform. And what ThreadFix lets you do is first create a consolidated view of your applications and vulnerabilities, right? So let's know where all the teams we have developing software, where are all the applications these teams are responsible for. All right, let's collect metadata about that where possible. And then we load in the results of all the different testing that we're doing: static testing, dynamic testing, interactive security testing, software composition analysis, manual pen testing, right? Create a central place where all of this data flows. Then we can prioritize risk decisions based on data. So we're not looking at, this PDF versus this PDF. We're not trying to, well, as they did in the ThreadFix origin story, the analyst is not like, their next task was not like, oh, okay, well, let's put everything in Excel and try to match these things up. Right now we've got data, and so we can slice and dice and filter this to figure out which of the vulnerabilities that we think are exposing us to the greatest risk. And then, and this is something we're going to talk a lot about today, it translates vulnerabilities to developers and the tools that they're already using. Right? How do we most effectively communicate with the development teams? And I'll give you a hint. It's not by emailing or printing out and handing off PDF documents. By doing all of this in one central place, that gives you access to powerful analytics, right? Because you can look to see how are these different teams performing versus one another, right? What if I train this team and I don't train this team, and I watch how they perform in the next month or two after that? Did that training help us or help this team? Do I like their security outcomes? Or do I think, well, training was nice and everybody liked it, but we didn't really see as much of a change in the outcome as we would like? Maybe we'll spend that budget in a different way going forward, right? But by having this all in one central platform, it gives you powerful analytics so that you can drive maturity in your program. And also drive efficiency with automation and orchestration. ThreadFix has a number of facilities that allow organizations to, to take advantage of automation that's in place to open up new avenues for automation and orchestration. And that's tremendous, because what ThreadFix lets you do is it lets you take the human capital that you have and focus it on human-only problems, right? That's what we want to get you doing is, don't have analysts doing stuff that automation can do. Have analysts doing stuff that only analysts can do. Again, the ThreadFix data flow, on the left side of the equation, we've got all these sources of data: static, dynamic, interactive, software composition analysis, network scanning tools, your manual pen testing, third-party pen testing, and the triage. And on the right side of the equation, reaching out to other stakeholders. Again, reporting and analytics, reaching out to the development teams and operations groups with their defect trackers and ticketing systems, communicating to GRC groups about risk, and so on and so forth. And again, this is the pipeline as data makes its way through ThreadFix. So who benefits from ThreadFix and how? The security team, the app security team, they're typically the group that owns and is running ThreadFix. And they use ThreadFix to run more efficiently and effectively, by getting greater testing throughput, using our normalization and deduplication in ThreadFix to get up to a 35% reduction in the findings that require triage. That's really where they get a lot of the benefit. Then we look at the development teams, allowing for this collaboration and more effective communication between security teams and dev teams, by communicating with them and the tools that they're already using and understanding the tool set that they're using. And the GRC teams, as well, they see a faster resolution of key vulnerabilities, and so they get more vulnerabilities fixed faster. A reduction in the mean time to fix. So let's talk now, or look at collaboration inside of security teams, right? So you're doing a bunch of testing, right? You've loaded in your static, your dynamic, your SCA, your pen test. You've got all this data that you've collected about vulnerabilities in your application. And now you've got to answer the tricky question of, like, which vulnerabilities are you going to fix, right? You're never going to fix everything. And to be candid, you're probably not going to look at everything, right? For anybody who's ever run, kind of an untuned static scanner, against an application that's got a lot of historical code in it, you just don't have time in the day to go through all the stuff that gets kicked out of there. And so you've really got to make a decision of determining, like, what actions can I take that are going to reduce the most risk? Everybody's got budgets, whether that's dollar budgets or, again, hours in the day, bandwidth budgets for people. Everybody's got budgets. You got to figure out how can I spend that budget most effectively. And so, asking questions about, looking at what's the remediation budget and how do you justify more. This is an area where you need to look at your organization and determine, hey, is this an organization that is practicing risk management, or is this an organization that is more control focused, right? And that's going to drive some of the decisions, whether you're saying, hey, we're going to use this metadata and severity to roll up and look at like, hey, we've got a more of a risk-centric view of which vulnerabilities are the worst. That's certainly the way that I prefer. Other organizations may just have a policy that says, hey, criticals and highs got to be fixed in this amount of time and whatever. All right, so that's something to look at in your organization. How do these decisions get made? And I prefer, again, to take more of a risk-oriented view of this. It's a question of does that type of thinking work in your environment? And so the critical decisions that have to be made when looking at these vulnerabilities is this a vulnerability a true or false positive, right? All scanners provide some level of false positives. All the application security testing vendors can come and fight me on this, guys. But that's a determination that's got to be made, right? A scanner or a tester found something that they believe to be a weakness or vulnerability. Is this truly something we need to worry about or not? Right? True positive or false positive? Once you've made that determination, it's a question of how serious is this vulnerability actually? Are there compensating controls in place? Or does the framework that the application is written in actually provide some protection that maybe the scanner didn't know about? But we need to determine how serious is this, and then in the aggregate, you've got to make the determination of like which of these vulnerabilities do we actually need to fix, right? Or would we prefer, given constraints, to have fixed? And so these internal critical communications, when looking at vulnerabilities, is making a determination. Hey, this one is better than it seems, or it's worse than it seems. And why did I come to making that decision? Looking at vulnerabilities to say, hey, this has an impact on our GRC concerns, right? We've got a service level agreement with this customer that says if we do a security test and we find a critical or a high, we have to respond in this type of a way. Also internal communications. No one is omniscient. People need to be able to reach out and say, hey, I need help making a decision about this issue, right? I don't have sufficient context or sufficient knowledge in order to make a true adjudication decision. And so these are the types of communications that need to go on in order to go through that triage process. At this point, I'll turn it over to Kyle here to go through how do those discussions or how do those workflows work in a ThreadFix platform environment. Let me just see if I can turn this over to Kyle. There you are, Kyle.
Perfect. Thank you. And now you should see my
there you go.
Portfolio page here. So a couple of things I want to show you guys around the ways that you can communicate this through your organization or between different groups within your organization. There's a couple of different options. One has been there for quite a while, which is the vulnerability comment tags. And so within ThreadFix, in the tagging administration section, if you're properly permissioned, you can create vulnerability-specific tags, application-specific tags. This metadata is useful for bundling the information, reporting on the information. But you can also create vulnerability comment tags specific to the kinds of information you want to impart when you are creating comments or adding comments to existing vulnerabilities. So in this particular case, I've created a few, mitigated, needs review, these sorts of things. So when I'm going through and looking at a given application as a triager, whether I'm a security champion on the development team or I'm a member of the security analyst team, I can appropriately label those comments that I'm making to make sure that the next group that needs to benefit from those comments can find them very easily, or can even build policies around being notified whenever one of those comments get triggered. So let's use for an example, I've got a series of things in here from Fortify. I want to make a comment on a couple of these vulnerabilities to just say that, I've looked at these particular issues here, maybe these three, and I've identified that these need to be a lower priority for whatever reason. So I can make a batch comment section here. I can say, hey, listen, for reasons, this probably is a series of low severity vulns. and then I can tag that with my reduce severity tag for the comments and add those comments to this. Now, once I've gone through and looked at these and determined that I want to drop these in priority, somebody may want to come back and check my work or validate. There may be some sort of process in place to ensure that if somebody does this, the person who is privileged enough to change the severity of a vulnerability can have their work checked. And so that's where you can go into your tagging filters and say, show me everything that's got a ThreadFix comment where I did a reduction of severity, and look at that very quickly. You can see what those vulnerabilities were whenever that's happened. If that's something that you approve and maybe you say, okay, this is good to go, you could go ahead and remove that vulnerability comment from the comment itself. You can see that from this view where the comment exists, but within the vulnerability itself, you can go and edit that comment to remove the tag. Another useful application of this communication would be, potentially around any sort of auditing, where you say you're reducing the severity of a vulnerability. You just want to mark it as a false positive for your own workflow because your application is behind a web application firewall. And we've got a WAF to protect this particular vulnerability from being exploited, but our process is that I need to tag any of those de-escalations for mitigating controls appropriately. And so when I make a comment on a particular vulnerability about that, I'm going to make that comment with a mitigation tag. Or, if it's related to PCI compliance concerns, I can make it with a PCI tag. All of this is stuff that you can then filter on and report on. So that's kind of one set of uses for specifically the vulnerability comment tags. But much more recently, we've added a bit more of direct communication flow between development teams and security teams within ThreadFix at a higher level, and that would be our statuses. We've added a series of statuses within ThreadFix, in the last year to help facilitate some of that communication. And this is specifically stuff that can be permitted for your users at a very granular level. So you can give your security champion or your development teams access to mark something as developer contested without giving them access to mark something as false positive. And so if you go through and look at, let's say we've got a series of insufficiently protected credentials for whatever reason, a developer may come in here and say, look, I've looked at these two things. I think this is a false positive. Like, we actually are protecting these credentials appropriately. So I'm going to change the status to contested. And if I was a developer, this would be the only thing that I would have access to. I'm showing you this as an admin so you can see all of the different statuses. But if I mark this as contested, then you can see that here within the development view or the vulnerability view. But you can also set up a policy for your application so that you can be sure and have things flagged whenever a developer wants to catch your attention with that. And that's what I've done here. I went and defined a specific policy on needs security review where I said, if any vulnerability has the status of developer contested, I need this to fail my policy so that I can know as a security team member, I've got to go in here and do some review, figure out what's going on. And again, we can filter on that to specifically get at all of the vulnerabilities that are developer contested and just review those very quickly. And if I, as the security enforcer, the security analyst, look at this and say, yeah, the guy's right, we're fine, I can go here and then mark the vulnerability status as false positive. Now, the good news about this is, one, it drops off my view. I don't have to worry about it anymore. And then when you go and look at the application itself, your policy is back into a passing state. So you now are good here. Things are copacetic and as designed, and you can move on with the rest of your review process. So these are a few different examples of how you can mark kind of triage process throughout the ThreadFix infrastructure and get notified or be able to report on that holistically within a given application, but also any of these filter sets that we just defined can be applied globally so you can review across your whole portfolio where these application vulnerabilities are being identified as potentially not as important or false positives or whatever. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dan.
Thanks, Kyle. Go back to the sharing. There we go. Fantastic. Good. And we've got a link to some additional resources here. There's a blog post that we have that covers some of this issue called Effective Security Team Collaboration. We've got the link to that there. And that is something definitely to take a look at if you'd like to read more about it. Now we'll look at the collaboration between security and development teams. And again, this really cuts to the heart of like the anti-pattern that we saw at that particular organization of how security teams were engaging with the development teams was really the driver for why we created ThreadFix in the first place. And so an important thing to understand as a security professional is that developers don't speak PDF. There's any number of different programming languages, Go, Python, C, Java. Developers speak a lot of them. They do not speak PDF. Bad news, they also don't speak Excel either. So if you're doing your application vulnerability management program in a giant Excel spreadsheet, that is not that's unfortunately not a recipe for success. When we look at effective development and security collaboration, the most critical thing that we've seen, and again, done in ThreadFix or outside of that, the most critical thing that we've seen is talking to the developers and the tools that they are already using. And this means the defect trackers, more broadly, the application lifecycle management. These days it mostly just means Jira. But talking to the developers in the teams that they're already using. Right. And there's a couple of advantages here. First, it shows some empathy and understanding, right? As a security team, it shows that you took the time to learn a little bit about these development teams and the tools that they use. It's been a number of years, but I remember, John Dixon used to speak at ISSA events back when people met in big rooms and had lunch for ISSA or other events, which seems to be less frequently in the last couple months. But again, a number of years ago, John would ask questions at ISSA events. Hey, who here is done, or is a programmer? You get like a smattering of hands in the room. I'd say, well, who of you has done programming in something other than Fortran or COBOL? And most of the hands went down. And certainly the population of security professionals at that point in time very much came either from the network and infrastructure world or from the audit world. And that's started to change, but it's still not ubiquitous. Again, a lot of organizations that we work with, the security teams, don't necessarily have a lot of experience with application development, especially not modern application development. Right, web applications, web frameworks, IDEs, the defect trackers, and things like that. And so, one of the things we found is taking the time to understand the tool set that the developers are using goes a long way. Because by doing that, you would know developers don't manage their tasks via PDF documents that are printed out or marked up or Excel spreadsheets. They're using Jira or some other defect tracking system. And that's how they're tracking, hey, this is the work in front of me that I need to be doing. This is the backlog of work that is still coming down the road for me. And this also lets you take advantage of a lot of sunk cost investments that these development teams have made. Development teams have spent a tremendous amount of money and time and other resources implementing these defect tracking systems, right? Selecting them, procuring them, deploying them, configuring them, getting all of the workflows set up of this is how we're going to handle our sprints, and this is how we tag things, and this is how we gauge our velocity, and this is the set of ceremonies or meetings that we have around this, right? The development teams have a tremendous amount invested in this. And if you think, just taking a step back and saying, what do I think is going to be more effective? Emailing a PDF to these people and asking them to take care of something, or taking advantage of the tremendous investment that they've made in these, defect tracking systems and the whole, infrastructure, corporate infrastructure around them. Like that lets you take advantage of a huge investment that they've made and slipstream the security work or the vulnerabilities that you want into the resolution process for the defects and other change requests that they're also aggregating. And what we love to see here is up to a 44% reduction in the mean time to fix or the mean time to remediation for vulnerabilities, for organizations using ThreadFix. And I love to see that, because what that shows is, that's an outcome that you can be happy about, right? Seeing fewer vulnerabilities, seeing more vulnerabilities fixed faster, that is a measurable, and it's a great security outcome, again, that we're really, really excited to see in environments. And so how do I, if I'm going to communicate with developers, how do I turn the vulnerabilities that the dev teams care about into defects or vulnerabilities that security teams care about into defects that the development teams care about? The kind of simplest way to do this with a one-to-one approach, right? Hey, I've got a scanner. It found some vulnerabilities. I'm just going to open a trouble ticket for each of those. That's a great way to get yourself murdered in the parking lot by your QA, by the QA lead on that application team, because you're going to spend more time administering the defects than actually fixing the issues. Instead, you want to look at bundling strategies. A very popular one is by vulnerability type, right? If I got a new application that I am just kind of bringing under management from a security standpoint, I run a scan. It's going to kick up maybe a bunch of cross-site scripting, SQL injection, stuff like that. Well, those are coding level issues that can be fixed in a pretty similar way, right? So for SQL injection, hey, we need to convert all of these into parameterized queries. For cross-site scripting, hey, we need to use these encoding libraries to do contextual encoding, whatever that might be. But like the individual fixes tend to be pretty small, right? Find the right line or lines of code, make a couple of coding changes, and then hopefully you run the compile and it works, and then you can get that through your whatever testing pipeline you've got. And so that's a very popular way to say, well, hey, if I've got 100 cross-site scripting vulnerabilities, let's make 5 defects with 20 each, right? Because that is a sensible amount of workload that somebody can get assigned. Okay, hey, well, what is this cross-site scripting? I need to use this library. Okay, I think I understand this. Great. Let me find this, fix it, find this, fix it, find this, fix it, find this, fix it. And so especially for new applications or applications that are newly being brought under some sort of testing and management from a security standpoint, that a lot of organizations have found that to be pretty effective. What we see in some organizations that have more mature applications or applications that have been through a vulnerability management process for some amount of time, hopefully you've got a lot of these, hopefully, in between the scans that you're doing, you're not going to see like, hey, this new coder introduced 14 new cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in the first week that they were there. I think we actually did see that in one client environment where they had a new coder that got brought on board, who managed just to introduce a huge number of new vulnerabilities in a very short amount of time. On the one hand, we're super happy to have the new team member who's very effective. On the other hand, we probably need to get this person some security training, or they're just going to continue like wreaking havoc, right? But on applications that have been under a more mature process for a while, it might be something by severity, right? Or individual vulnerabilities. When you did a pen test and said, hey, here's the 2 criticals that came out of this, hand those to somebody to get them to fix that stuff. And there can be other approaches as well. Again, making a determination in your organization, how does that dev team want to see that stuff packaged? And that's a conversation to have, because they should be able to tell you that and let you know, hey, here's how we do our Scrum meetings. This is kind of the task size that we like to have. We have, certain security people that are going to get all the security stuff, or we have like, hey, everybody, should be knowing how to fix cross-site scripting. They should be able to characterize, here's how I want you to communicate this to us. Here's how I want this stuff bundled in order to make that communication as efficient and effective as possible. And now we'll turn things over to Kyle to look through, how do these workflows get implemented in ThreadFix. I'm going to stop the share. Kyle should be good to go.
Terrific. All right, cool. So as Dan had mentioned, there's a lot of different options in bundling these together, and we allow you to automate these in a bunch of different ways. But before we look at that, let me show you what it looks like to do it by hand. Because a lot of teams will still do this by hand. In fact, they prefer to do it this way because they want to make sure what they're sending to the developers has actually been reviewed before they send it. So if we look at again, we'll go to this use of hard-coded password. We've got a series of 3 vulnerabilities here that were all identified by both checkmarks and Fortify. We bundled them into 3 vulns. So I'm going to grab those and say, I want to create a new defect. In this particular case, I have configured multiple Jira defect trackers with this ThreadFix instance, but I've associated just this particular project with this ThreadFix application because this is the project that the developers who would be resolving this application are working within. So this is very configurable within the configuration section of ThreadFix for defect trackers. But when I select that, it goes and pulls for that particular project, for that particular Jira connection, all of the different fields that are configured. And you can see I've got lots of custom fields that have been built here. Actually, has been built by our QA team. But this is a very common scenario when you've got ALM in-house that gets managed by typically someone that's affiliated closely with your development group. They start putting in whatever the development group dreams up that they want in terms of custom statuses, custom fields. And so all of this is dynamically populated by ThreadFix. And you can also see here, sorry, I glazed over this. I've set up this connection to have a default profile. I've set many different profiles up that can be applied, but I have a default profile defined that will automatically select the issue type I want, automatically fill out the description I want, put it in the right project. I have most of the required fields defined. So the summary, I'm just pulling the CWE summary. All of this is something that you can define in your profile. The one thing I haven't done is the assignee, because I want to send this based on something. So I think we should give Dan some work. Again, this assignee list is dynamically populated from the project as it's configured. So you'll only be able to assign it to those Jira users that have access to this project and can be assigned tickets. And then, this is a quick review of where these particular issues that I've selected are, but let me go ahead and submit this defect. This goes out to Jira, creates the tickets that are necessary, and then associates them back to the ThreadFix vulnerabilities. In this case, each ticket was given the same number because I bundled them together. If I wanted to create one individual defect per vulnerability, that's another option for ThreadFix to allow you to do. When you create defect, you can instead choose to create multiple defects. But in this case, I wanted to bundle them based on this because I figured they would be resolved in the same way, hopefully by the same developer at the same time. So if I click on any of these, this will actually link me into the actual Jira project, the ticket that was generated, and I can see the information that I provided here. All of the information, you see lots of custom fields that are empty because I didn't choose to fill them out, but these would all be filled out if I had had that part of my profile. Additionally, the description field here is pretty empty with just some general information, but anything that you want to provide from the scanning tool into the description for the developers to review when they're remediating it, including custom guidance that you as an organization have for this particular CWE. All of that can be configured within ThreadFix and automatically injected into the defect when you create it through the use of our default guidance feature, as well as our velocity templating feature. But let's say the developer got this, they looked at it and they said, okay, I have resolved this issue. This updates the ticket in Jira. It gives me an opportunity to say some stuff. I'm going to be a little bit quiet about it and just resolve the ticket. In Jira, that's fine, but in ThreadFix, what do? I mean, inherently, the security team wants to trust but verify what the development team is doing. And so just because that has been transitioned does not mean it's going to drop off this list. ThreadFix can be configured to update your statuses from your defect trackers on a regular rhythm, but rather than wait for that automatic update to occur, I'm going to manually trigger the defect status update. And so now we can refresh our results and get any changes to the defect status that occurred. And you can see now we're communicating to the security team that the developers believe they fixed this. Again, it still shows up on the list. No scan's been uploaded to verify this fix. But as I was talking earlier about building notifications and policies around things that you can filter on, this is another prime example of something a security team may want to build a policy around, because they can go and look for any given application if there are any needs for a new scan. This needs scan filter specifically goes and finds those defects that a developer has marked as complete that no subsequent scan has been uploaded to verify. And so this will give you a quick view of, oh, I've got some stuff to do here. Let me upload a new scan. Or if this was from a manual pen test, let me go and have the pen test team review the remediation effort and validate that it is good. And then these can be closed down. If for any reason a subsequent scan comes in that proves the vulnerability is still present, then that would be something that you could trigger on a remediation failure. That would be anything that a defect reports as being resolved, but a subsequent scan after that report came in finds that vulnerability still open. And then needs verification would actually just be the inverse of that, where you've got a vulnerability that has been closed down in ThreadFix, but the defect in Jira still shows that it's open. So there's a number of different ways to group that, and there are a number of different ways that this can facilitate the communication between developer activity and security team review. Finally, anything that you do in the ThreadFix defect creation can be automated. You can bundle these things together by CWE, you can bundle them together by severity, or you can choose to do both, where if you've got a series of SQL injections that are critical and a series of SQL injections that are high, you can choose to create one defect for all the criticals and one defect for all the highs that are introduced with a new check-in or with a new code scan. And all of that is centrally configurable by a ThreadFix administrator and can be, like those rule sets can be applied to individual applications. So different applications can have different thresholds beyond which they want to have defects get created when scans get uploaded. With that, I guess I'll pass it back to Dan.
All right. Thanks, Kyle. Perfect. Good. And so, yeah, just to point out, and again, the deck and everything will be available here shortly. But we got another blog post that talks about security teams collaborating with development teams. That talks through in a text-based format some of the interactions that Kyle's talking about there. We've also got a couple of other resources that may be valuable. We've got we've been producing these a series of short videos. They're what do they call, about 2 minutes?
Yeah, between 2 and 5, depending on the topic.
2 to 5 minutes, depending on the topic, on different aspects of ThreadFix, the capabilities that the ThreadFix platform has in it, and how those capabilities get used to address different client concerns. That's one of the things that we try to do with ThreadFix is to be very flexible, right? Every organization runs their testing and application security program in a different way. Big organizations run different parts of it. Different teams are going to do things different way. And so we try to be extremely flexible in the models that we provide for people to interact with ThreadFix, to get data in, to triage that data, to get data out. And that's one of the big things that I've seen for ThreadFix versus other other environments, is we try to have a lot of more than one way to do certain things. And so there's 2 videos out there that talk about the tagging capabilities in ThreadFix, some of the stuff that Kyle touched on. That's something that is out there and available to for y'all to take a look at, or to pass on to team members that may be interested in that. And now we'll open this up for questions. So if folks want to use the Q&A or the chat to send anything in, let us know. So one question about how do developers get access to ThreadFix? So in a typical ThreadFix environment, most developers aren't going to interact with ThreadFix, and that's by design. And again, kind of the ThreadFix model, or the ThreadFix thinking is, we're going to provide ThreadFix for the security team, for the app security team, and they're going to be the main owners of ThreadFix. And what we want to do is reach out and communicate with other stakeholders in the tools that they're already using. And so that's one of the big things that Kyle demonstrated was, instead of telling developers, hey, you've got new security work to do, log into ThreadFix and we're going to tell you what to do and how to do it. Instead, we want to push that information over to the teams that are already using ThreadFix. That are already using the defect trackers, Jira, or whatever that might be, because they've already got a login, they've already got all their work organized in there, right? We just want to inject the security work into that process. And so philosophically, that's what we're typically trying to do, is to say, hey, if you roll out ThreadFix, you don't need to train your 10,000 developers in your organization on ThreadFix. What we do see a common pattern, though, is limited access for a certain subset of developers, whether those are tech leads for certain applications, again, very commonly used by, for organizations that are rolling out security champions programs, and where a subset of the developers get access to ThreadFix, as Kyle talked about, looking at the permissions for different for different statuses. So you could say, well, hey, we're going to allow security champions. They can't mark things as false positives, but they can make things developer contested. And so we have the granularity of the granularity of this. Allows you to be pretty creative in how you structure this. And so that is the most common use cases. You take a subset of your developers and say, here are the people that we specifically want to participate more actively in the triage process, and we're going to give that subset accounts on ThreadFix where they have accounts that are limited to certain capabilities and typically also limited to a subset of the applications in the organization. So again, our model is not to have, rolling out ThreadFix is not to have all of the everybody in the organization working in it, right? We want to make it as non-disruptive as possible and take advantage of all the investments that's already been made. Let's see, next question here. Does ThreadFix support AWS Inspector findings? We don't have a native connector with AWS Inspector, but what we do have is is a JSON-based file format that you can use to get data into ThreadFix. And we've got some utilities around that to allow you to take structured data to convert it into the format that we need. And so it may be a little tricky to shoehorn with the stuff that AWS Inspector finds. I'm not super deep in with, I haven't personally inspected the output of that tool, but the way that I would get that data into ThreadFix would be to pull the data from AWS Inspector, put that in a .threadfix format, and send that along. And so, and just load that into ThreadFix. And I can send it a link to that ThreadFix format. And again, if you've got further questions, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. So here I've been asked the following, like our take. Why would a company need a vulnerability management system like ThreadFix in addition to a defect tracker like Jira? Well, because if people weren't buying ThreadFix, then why we wouldn't be able to have these fun webinars? Is a tremendously self-serving answer. But what I will say, slightly less flippantly, is we think that there are different stakeholders, right? And so ThreadFix is geared toward the application security team, and it does the stuff that the application security and vulnerability management team needs it to do. One of the things, and I haven't talked a lot about this today, but the other issue with the ThreadFix origin story, in addition to the communication problem, there's also a data management problem. Most of the organizations using ThreadFix have somewhere between 2 and 5 scanners, and that tends to be going up, right, across the network infrastructure, SAST, DAST, SCA, IAST. And like what ThreadFix does in the front end when it pulls all this data in is it normalizes it and deduplicates it. And we've got a couple of patents on some of the things that we do there. And so we pull in this data, and what we see is up to a 35% reduction in the overall finding count based on that ingestion process. And the value there for security analysts is twofold. Number one, you have less stuff to look at, right? Because we've taken 100 things and we've squished that down, and now you've got 65 things, which is fewer things, which is better in this case. And in addition to that, we provide better context because we can say, hey, this scanner saw the vulnerability, and here's this scanner's perspective on it, and this scanner found it, and here's this other scanner's perspective on it. And so that normalization and deduplication process provides value in dealing with the volume of data that organizations see that they're getting out of these programs where they have multiple tools. And that's one of the things we found is even organizations that think like, oh, we're a XYZ shop. Well, they're actually an XYZ shop and a Burp Suite shop, and they have manual pen tests that are going on. Oh, and by the way, this group also has, check marks or Fortify or Veracode. And so, even moderately sophisticated app security programs tend to be multi-activity and multi-vendor. And so ThreadFix helps deal with the complexity of that, and it gives you one pipeline and consistency of ingestion so that once you've got your kind of cleaned up set of vulnerabilities, you can bundle those, whether it came from a static scanner or a dynamic scanner or SCA, you can bundle those and ship those into Jira and then monitor that. And so instead of having a bunch of stuff dumping data into Jira, and maybe you have duplicate tickets, maybe there's not consistency in the way that the tickets are being created. This team does one thing, this team does another. ThreadFix provides you with that. And in addition, by having all that data in one place, you can report on your program as a whole to say, this is what we're seeing out of our static analysis efforts. This is what we're seeing out of our dynamic analysis efforts. This is what we're seeing from our IAST rollout. This is what we're seeing from these pen testers. This is how the different scanners stack up against one another. It gives you metrics specific to your application security program. And so the environments where ThreadFix tends to provide them, if you just have like one scanner, you're probably not going to get a lot of value out of ThreadFix. But in an environment where you have multiple activities, multiple technologies, and you want that normalization and deduplication, and you want that unified pipeline so you can enforce security-specific policies, those are the environments where ThreadFix tends to provide the most value. Let's see. Does ThreadFix correlate condense the same vulnerability found by different testing methods? Yeah. And so exactly. And I just talked a little bit about that. So ThreadFix has the ability to pull in and normalize and dedupe static, dynamic, and interactive security testing the results of those tools. And we have, as I mentioned, 2 patents on what we call our hybrid analysis mapping technology, where for certain languages and frameworks, you give ThreadFix access to the source code. It looks at that, builds an attack surface model of the application, and then feeds, and then can like correlate between static and dynamic. And the same thing with correlating between, if you're using check marks and Fortify, you've got 2 static results, it'll normalize those. You're using Burp Suite and AppScan or Web Inspect, and it'll normalize those as well. And so, yeah, so that's something we've spent a lot of engineering effort on our analysis engine. And the correlation accuracy, again, static to static and dynamic to dynamic is pretty straightforward, like unless the data coming out of the scanner is wrong or something like that. And I want to say for the static to dynamic, it is, if as long as it has access to the source code, for, again, supported languages and frameworks, yeah, I want to say it's just like it's like 76% or something. Like we developed that technology in conjunction with, or funded by the Department of Homeland Security. And so I'm trying to think back of some of the reports we provided there. So for supported environments, it's usually pretty good.
Well, and I can actually speak a little bit more to that. The way that we built our merge engine and the logic kind of flow that we take to identify overlap between static to static, dynamic to dynamic, or cross. And recently, when we added this for SCA findings as well. So if you've got your dependency findings and maybe you've got different teams using different tools, all of that is still supported now. When you, like, if you're moving from black duck to dependency check or white source, one of the other benefits of a tool like ThreadFix is it allows for that tool agnosticism. Is you need to migrate from one to another within your organization. We are going to continue to be the central source of data and also be able to handle, well, Black Duck reported all these findings. We haven't fixed all of them yet, but now we're using white source and we don't want to have duplication. Well, we do that merge as well. And so back to the accuracy question, ThreadFix is targeted specifically to make sure we have utmost confidence when we do the merge, which is to say we don't really have a false positive rate. We have occasionally false negatives. And in the ham, that's the most frequent one, which is to say static to dynamic. There are probably lots of opportunities for us to do a merge. If a human looked at it, they could probably find merges that we missed. But a human should never be able to go into ThreadFix and find a merge that shouldn't have happened. And so that's our accuracy is intended to, again, get that 35% or better reduction rate. And that number, by the way, isn't generated by us. Like, it's an actual number that we put together from data volunteered from a multitude of our clients across different enterprises. So that reduction rate is what it is, but that number is valid merges. So there may be additional like 10 or 15% we could have merged, but we didn't because we didn't have the confidence level there to say we want to go ahead and make these two vulns one. That's probably another side of the answer to your question around our accuracy. It is very accurate where we do merge. Sometimes where we don't merge, there are opportunities that we could have, but we didn't want to do that because we weren't 100% sure.
Yeah. And I think they call those type 1 and type 2 errors just to make that is like completely inscrutable as possible, as opposed to calling them false positives and false negatives. Excellent. Well, any other questions from anybody? Oh, perfect. We'll get the recording out here before too much longer. And if you have colleagues, you can obviously share the recording with them. For anybody that missed, you can't hear me right now, but you'll be also receiving a link to the recording. And again, I just want to thank everybody for taking the time out of your day to spend some time with us today. Again, tell everybody that I hope everybody's safe and healthy out there. These are kind of crazy times. I, for one, have been very grateful. I'm fortunate. I think all of us in the security industry are in an industry that has not been impacted like a lot of others, and also lends itself to remote work. So I'm thankful for the situation that I find myself in. I hope you all, again, are safe and healthy. Thanks for coming out today, and I'm sure we'll talk down the line.
Thank you.